Hey, good evening. Thanks for joining me again. This is part three that we're talking about addiction and escaping that, and looking at this both from a science standpoint, from a neurobiological standpoint, looking at 12-step recovery and those principles in 12-step recovery, and then looking at that through a biblical lens, and looking at what's missing in that and what fulfills and fleshes that out to try to get people to this fully recovered and really restored, and to be the people that God created us to be. Before we start this evening, let me just open us in prayer. Father, I'm thankful, as always, that you're in love with us. I'm thankful for grace. I'm thankful for mercy. I'm thankful for eternity. Father, I'm thankful that every good thing comes from you. I'm thankful that all truth is yours. All truths in science are yours. You created this amazing universe. And we're awed and humbled to be created in your image. So I'm thankful for the ability to be in communion with you. I'm thankful for the church. I'm thankful for community. Father, just pray for me as I speak. I pray for listeners as they hear. I pray for people whose family has been touched by addiction. I pray for those people who are struggling and or in the early phase of recovering. Father, I just pray that this will be helpful or enlightening or reassuring. Father, so just be with us. And I pray this in Christ's name. Amen. So this is part three, and last week we had closed when I had finished talking about cocaine and stimulants and how those things affected the brain. So people, if you're joining us in part three, just would encourage you to listen to part one and part two. This is going to be very science-based from a neurobiology standpoint. As I said, really in my prayer, there is nothing threatened. Christ and Christianity are not threatened at all by science. In fact, it just further elucidates and or takes in a part of the world that God designed. And in fact, the more you know, the more I'm actually awed. The more I'm actually convinced that there's a creator and a designer. So if you're hearing me present this and you've clicked on to hear a Bible study in some fashion, and just we will bring more of that in later in the series. But again, I at this point still want to focus and look at exactly kind of what's going on from a disease standpoint. So we closed last week in talking about this cocaine, and I closed in talking about these pathways that are damaged that connect our prefrontal cortex, which is where decision making comes in. So this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortical structures, and how they communicate with our reward pathway, where all the diseases of addiction live. So we're gonna move into opiates. Now, for those not familiar, right, opiates, that is the pain medication family of drugs. So you'll hear them classified and also talked about as opioids. So been a lot of press about the opioid crisis, right? The opioid epidemic in America, and a huge cause of death, right, is accidental opioid overdose. And so there's been a lot of press about opioids over the past few years. So from an opioid standpoint, if we look at where they work in the brain, right, it's a little more extensive than what we saw with the stimulants. So you can see effect in this outside part of the cortex, as well as some of the prefrontal cortical structures. That part of the brain that I talked about, called the several names, but the prethalamic stripe, here in the midbrain, and then right there in that purple region in the reward pathway. Now, initially, I want to talk about this outside part here. So we've known for decades, right? Opioids first came into England in the late 1800s from out of China with opium, and we've known for years that if you take too much opiate, then you become cortically suppressed, right? I mean, you become impaired. So for me as an internal medicine doc, if I'm taking care of somebody in the hospital and I give them too much pain medication, we've known forever that can make you impaired. You can become altered, a fall risk, slurry speech. So involvement in that high level of cortical function. So that's been known for years. So a little background though, as far as what we now know also. So I was a well-trained internal medicine doc. I go into practice in Waxahachie, Texas, a small town south of Dallas. And I have a young man that I'm taking care of who's a soccer player at this little Assembly of God, Southwest Assembly of God College in Waxahachie. He hurts his knee badly, and he comes in to see me right after the injury. No orthopedist in town full-time in those years, and he's got a huge swollen knee. I stick a needle in, I drain some blood out of the joint to try to give him some relief. I order an MRI of the knee for the following week. And presumably, this is a Thursday afternoon, I'm thinking he's probably got a pretty bad injury. I put him in something called the knee immobilizer, and I start him on some pain medication. So I give him a prescription for Vicodin Extra Strength, which is hydrocodone mixed with acetaminophen or Tylenol. And he comes back to see me that following Tuesday. He had the MRI the day before, and I'm talking to him and say, hey, MRI looks pretty bad, but how are you doing? And he's like, I'm doing okay. How are you doing pain-wise? I'm doing okay. And then he looks at me and he goes, hey, Dr. Boone, those medicines you gave me, I feel great when I take those medicines. Now, I'm the new young doc in town. I've already had people who struggle with addiction come to my office trying to get prescription medicines from me, and nobody who's ever tried to get pain pills from a doctor goes in and says, I feel great when I take these pills, right? So I'm talking to him and I'm shocked at what he's just told me. Like, what do you mean you feel great? He goes, I don't know. He said, I've never had anything like this before. I just feel I feel good. And I'm looking at him because I had recently had a surgical procedure. I got a prescription for that medication, the exact medicine I gave him, and it made my mouth a little dry, a little constipation. I mean, I'm like, and then he's telling me he feels good. I'm so what do you mean he goes, I don't know. It's crazy. He goes, I had a test study this weekend. I did great on my test yesterday. I have more focus. I have more energy. I feel better. And I looked at him. I'm like, oh my gosh, they gave you the wrong prescription. This young man was describing this energized, focused, almost stimulant type of experience, right? And so I said, hey, do you have your bottle with you? I think they gave you the wrong prescription. He goes, yeah, I got it right here. Reaches into his backpack, pulls out a little bottle. I look at the bottle. It's got his name on it. It's got Vicodin ES. Pre-generic days. So Vicodin ES written on it. I'm like, I don't think so. I take open the bottle. I pour one in my hand. I'm looking at that, and it, Vicodin ES written on the tablet. Actually, back in those days, I'm like, these? And he goes, yeah. And I'm looking at, and I'm thinking, like, I don't understand that, is what I'm thinking in my head, right? And he's like, can I get more of those? I'm like, no. And I put the lid back on, and I don't think about that experience for almost 20 years. I shift into addiction medicine, and what we find is that every opioid patient, every patient whose drug of choice, that the chemical that they most like are the opioid family of medications, every one of those people, energized, activated, feel better, more energy, more focus. Now, there is this thing that I kind of look at as a biphasic response. So early on, as that drug begins to build in their system, they have this energized both sense of feel good or a euphoric type effect, but also this increased in focus that we can see up here in this cortical and prefrontal cortical area. Now, I don't have any family history of addiction, as I mentioned, and my experience with that is nothing like his. I don't get any of that, not one bit, right? So when people who don't struggle with addiction are talking to somebody who's struggling with hydrocodone, oxycodone, heroin, one of the opioid family, and in your own experience, you're like, oh my gosh, that stuff makes me feel terrible. When I had that surgery, why would anybody do that? And their experience is different than mine. The analogy, right? I don't have diabetes. I can't talk to a diabetic and tell him, hey, I can eat cake and pie and don't get sick. Why can't you? I don't have this, right? Something that is different, something that is fundamentally different. Now, there is this initial sort of euphoric response, but then as the dose and the level goes higher, it gets to a certain point where all of a sudden they become cortically impaired. So everybody will get this cortical impairment at certain levels, but people who struggle with substance use disorder, now this is almost all of my patients, but not all of them. So some of my alcohol patients or cocaine patients or sedative patients, they may not have this experience with opioids. Most of them do, but every one of my opiate patients has this experience. Energized, and then suddenly they become impaired. So we all get cortical impairment at a certain level, but the substance use disorder patient typically has this different response with this sense of being energized, euphoric sensation. Now, right here in that prethalamic stripe area, we get the same thing I talked about with cocaine, that mindless, repetitive activity, further stimulus that without thinking, your gut reaction, your gut feel is to just act, this automated sort of response. The next thing you know, you're trying to get a refill, you're looking for pills, you're trying to take a pill without contemplating, thinking through that experience. Now, right here in the midbrain, this central area, I'm kind of highlighting with this, that is where pain is controlled. So, we talked about at the beginning of this series that the midbrain is where all of the key elements of survival live: breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, appetite, eating, but also pain is actually a survival mechanism. So if you think about it, right, if I can't tell that I'm too close to the fire and my leg is burning, that's bad. Pain is actually a survival mechanism, right? So the fact that it takes us away, it makes sense that we're built with this very sort of intrinsic thing of pain avoidance from a survival standpoint. So that is where opioids work on the pain fibers, which I'm so thankful that we have something that works for that if you think about severe traumatic pain or surgical pain. But also, I mentioned that's where our breathing is controlled. Now, unfortunately, opioids at a certain level block that respiratory drive. So that part of my brain that senses drops in oxygen levels, increases in carbon dioxide levels. So if I take somebody sitting at rest or I take somebody actively walking, jogging, exercising, their oxygen levels stay exactly the same. And they stay the same because as I use more energy, use more oxygen, I take in deeper, more rapid breaths to then balance that. Well, that's blocked by opioids. So the way opioids unfortunately kill people, how people die of these, so frequent accidental overdose deaths. In 2018, it was 115 people a day in the United States died from an accidental opioid overdose. Those numbers are higher in 2020 with COVID and isolation. So it appears that opioid overdose deaths, both based on that, as well as we now have another very powerful opioid that's really contaminated the drug user population, which is fentanyl, which is a very powerful opioid narcotic that's incredibly potent. So very small doses can shut down the respiratory drive. And so they simply quit breathing. They stop breathing and they die what we call a hypoxic death. So opioid deaths happen because of what happens here. Now, but what makes opioids addictive is what happens in the reward pathway there in that purple area. Earlier in the lecture series, right, I talked about that part of the brain and the dopamine receptors, but also that there is an opioid receptor there in the reward pathway. So in the reward pathway, we have a specific receptor that responds to opiates, that responds to heroin, that responds to hydrocodone. This is in my pleasure reward pathway. Like, why is that? And then we came to learn, and in fact, the Nobel Prize was won in some of this research and data, that in reality, that's actually a natural occurring opiate receptor. So our bodies make something called beta endorphins. And the beta endorphins is a natural opioid. And so that receptor in my reward pathway is built to respond to the beta endorphin system. Some of the most intense stimuli for the beta endorphin system is hard physical exercise. So 45 minutes of sustained exercise, heart rate greater than 120 beats a minute, gives me a surge of beta endorphin, which stimulates my opiate receptor, which gives me this sense of well-being. It's like you're actually rewarded for exercise. From a survival standpoint, right? What a cool design that there's something that is good for us, and we get some instantaneous increase in energy, increased sense of well-being. It's where the concept of the runner's high came from, right? I don't think I've ever experienced that, but certainly that improved sense of energy, improved sense of well-being. And so when the beta endorphins activate that receptor, there's about 130% more dopamine that is produced. Sex, little beta endorphin production, so procreation, right? Survival of the species, that gift that God said to populate the earth, right? It makes sense to me. Certain high-calorie foods, if starvation had been the number one cause of death in mankind for hundreds of years, right? It makes sense that we would be rewarded that sense from foods that may be higher in caloric source. So that's what the system is built for. So what happens is that opiates, however, so if I take codeine, hydrocodone, oxycodone, a popular pain medication that was not thought to be addictive for a long period of time, tramadol or Ultram, all of those things stimulate the opioid receptor, but instead of a minor stimulation, it supersedes that peak max. We talked about the sexual experience of up to 150% increase in dopamine, but when I take these other compounds, I get 200% plus increase in dopamine activity. I then get that same damage. I get that same damage to my receptor system, the same suppression of that receptor, which doesn't allow me to feel things to the same intensity, which leads to higher amounts of usage. And so it was 1 hydrocodone, then it was 2, then it was 3, then it was 4, then it was 5. And it's not uncommon. I'll have somebody comes in that are taking 20, 30, 40 tablets a day of hydrocodone, spending amazing amounts of money on that, right? Trying to sort of chase that. And then oxycodone. And then unfortunately, heroin is actually cheaper than even these prescription pills. And so now there's been this huge sort of increase in heroin usage, and the heroin purity unfortunately allows you to have amazing absorption of that, whether you take it in through your nose or if you can actually inhale that from a smoking standpoint. And so we get this very intense stimulation of our opioid receptor. We get that same desensitization of those receptors, right? And then my screen just quit. Okay, let me go back. My apologies. Okay, so we get that same activation of the receptor, but then that's what makes me say I like it, but then that continued levels that are greater than 150%, and then my brain has to neuroadapt. I get the same damage to those neural feedback, that area from my prefrontal cortex that helps me have impulse control and good decision making, right? I get the same damage to those structures like we talked about with cocaine or stimulants. Now, marijuana. Marijuana has obviously been an incredibly hot topic. Multiple states that have now legalized marijuana, cannabis. I saw in the news just yesterday that Mexico is going to legalize cannabis, and so there's there's been obviously a lot of discussion on cannabis. And so if we actually look at where marijuana acts in the brain, you can see a lot of receptor areas in this brain, right? And so you see up here in the cortex, in that high functioning thinking, the prefrontal cortical area, impulse control, you see all of these areas, right? And so the concept sometimes when patients tell me, they're like, hey, Dr. Boone, nobody can even tell I'm smoking, right? And it's not an issue, right? I'm like, your parents talked about you looked a little high, you looked a little stoned. There was this kind of glazy, you weren't at 100%, right? I mean, there's a lot of cortical receptors that are involved with cannabis, and especially at higher doses of cannabis. Now, let me just, when I say higher doses, let me just talk about that just for a second. So marijuana, right? Most of the active ingredient that typically gives that sort of euphoric is typically the chemical called THC, or tetrahydrocannabidiol. So THC is that portion of that gives us that euphoric experience. So if I go back, for example, to the late 1960s, early 1970s, if I think back to the Woodstock days, for those of you who either obviously recall that or have read about that, and the rock and roll concert, and I think about these sort of shirtless rock and roll guys smoking a joint, right, a marijuana cigarette. If we look at marijuana concentrations at that point in time, marijuana at that point in time was typically somewhere around 1 to 2% THC by weight. So if somebody bought 100 grams of marijuana, only 1.5 to 2 grams of that was actually the chemical that gave them the high that they were looking for. In 2020, right, that average concentration was now around 18%. So with sort of harvesting and genetic techniques and refinement, then marijuana, the flower, has become increasingly high in concentration of THC. And so you can buy extremely high grade, quote unquote, marijuana that may be 30% THC by weight. Commonly now they're actually able to concentrate this, and we talk about, you might hear or have read about the THC concentrate. So I'll have patients that can buy this oil or waxy formulation of this that's called wax or dab. It's almost odorless. It's the most common introduction now of marijuana actually in the adolescent population is no longer through a marijuana cigarette or a joint. It's actually the concentrate that can be introduced into a vaporizer or like an electronic cigarette device. And so you can smoke this incredibly high concentration that may be 75, 80, 90% THC by weight. So from a visual standpoint, right, somebody who's smoking, so there's something called a blunt, which is basically, it's like a cigar that they open the lining of the cigar and take out the tobacco, and it's filled then with cannabis, right, with marijuana. So one of those things that's called a blunt is equal to 3 joints. So based on just the 18% number, right, then somebody who's smoking 1 blunt in 2020, 2021 would be the equivalent of that same person smoking 54 joints, 54 marijuana cigarettes all at the same time, right? So from a potency standpoint, marijuana has become a significantly more potent chemical. And so we can see all of these receptors up here in the cortex that are activated. This preflammic stripe do the same thing over and over again. Right here below the reward pathway, this part of the brain, sort of hippocampal region, is where there's short-term to long-term memory conversion, right? So there's a lot of, brilliant people in the world, but there's not a lot of 4.0 marijuana users. There's a few of them out there, but in general, most young people who start smoking cannabis on a regular and heavy basis don't notice that grades go up, that college performance increases, right? That's not the norm. So this short-term to long-term memory conversion, a disturbing study that came out of New Zealand and Australia a few years ago, people smoking cannabis regularly under the age of 17, by age 35, a 12-point drop in IQ. That study was hated by the cannabis growers and by that industry. That study was relooked at in one of our what we call peer-reviewed journals called The Lancet a couple of years later. Well done study. Just it's a little bit disturbing. You can see involvement down here in the cerebellum, that part of the brain where balance and coordination is controlled. Now, this can be very profound in younger people. There was a disturbing YouTube video, must have been 9 or 10 years ago. These two young men were shown sharing a marijuana cigarette or a blunt with their 3-year-old and 4-year-old nephews. Now, they videoed themselves handing drug to the child, right? They both went to prison for a long period of time. But these little kids, they lost balance, right? They become what we call ataxic. They started stumbling and falling down, looking drunk or profoundly impaired. Now we don't see that degree, but nowadays, because of the potency of cannabis, it's not uncommon that when people use high-grade cannabis, they get a little spin, a little, ooh, that was strong, this kind of thing. We see a lot of snowboarders, skateboarders smoking marijuana, not running into trees. But again, cerebellar coordination potentially might, if you look in some of the states that have legalized cannabis, right, there's a little bit of impairment if you look at accident rates and stuff, which probably has to do with potentially some speed of response as well as potentially some coordination issues. But then you see heavy concentration right there in the reward pathway. Now, in the reward pathway, we have an actual receptor, a THC receptor, that again is in my pleasure center that responds to marijuana. And when that data again was discovered, again, it was just fascinating. Like, why in the world? Well, you know what? California, Oregon, some of the big cannabis growing states, when that data first came out, the internet, the blogs were, oh my gosh, we're built for this. We're designed for this. We're supposed to use this stuff, right? And the researchers are going, probably not. And it actually only took about 18 months before they identified the endocannabinoids. So kind of like the beta endorphins, that opiate receptor was not actually built for heroin or oxycodone or whatever. That was built for our natural compounds or beta endorphin system. So with this, we have a natural compound called the endocannabinoids. So this is actually an endocannabinoid receptor is what it's designed for. And the endocannabinoids do a lot of different things. And in fact, so there's been obviously a lot of press about CBD, cannabidiol, which is one of the other ingredients that comes from the marijuana plant, but also comes from the hemp plant. So there may well be some usage, medical usage for CBD. That data is actually still out. So at this point, I'm not a huge fan because I don't feel like we have enough science behind it. But THC, right, we have a specific receptor in the reward pathway for THC. So the endocannabinoids, this is actually an endocannabinoid receptor, and it's one of the major drivers, for example, in the whole animal kingdom for normal food intake. So all the way down to invertebrates, down to jellyfish, mediated via the endocannabinoid system. Now, when my endocannabinoids stimulate that receptor, I get about a 120 to 130% surge. So it's less than that peak natural 150. But what happens is that marijuana comes in here, it hijacks that endocannabinoid receptor, and I get levels that are up around 165 to 170%. Now, when I'm presenting this data at work and I have patients who are using methamphetamine and cocaine and heroin, and commonly my marijuana users are like, hey, we're barely above that 150% peak. But the problem is It's how often we go above that, how high it goes up, like with the cocaine patients, the methamphetamine patients, up to 1,100% over that 150% max. My alcohol patients who repetitively, every day, multiple times a day, for hours every afternoon, evening, they're keeping their alcohol levels elevated and up and taking that above the 150% threshold. But then we have marijuana, and marijuana has an incredibly long half-life. So marijuana stays in our system for days. So my average marijuana user doesn't clear and have a normal drug screen until around day 21. The longest reported positive drug screen for marijuana with somebody documented to have no recurrent use was 77 days, right? So what happens is we have this sustained stimulation, which then keeps these dopamine levels elevated, which then my brain has to neuroadapt. And so we get a greater, and it's simplistic, but a greater desensitization of the dopamine receptors, right? And so what do we see in real life that my heavy marijuana users, what do you enjoy? What do you have so much fun doing? How do you feel your reward pathway, right? And so it makes sense to me when I have these huge stimulations like I talked about with cocaine and with methamphetamine and heroin. But again, because of the sustained half-life, I get this greater desensitization. And so the kid that used to love to play basketball, when he hit a three-pointer, he was so excited, going on a family vacation, going fishing with his dad. Those things were fun. Those things drove their dopamine levels went up 130%. But now 130% doesn't do it because he needs 160%, 165% to try to feel something. And so he's smoking higher and higher concentrates of cannabis trying to feel that. But then those other things, they become boring. Why are they boring? Because he can't feel it anymore. She can't feel it anymore. You used to have so much fun doing this. Like, I know, it's just boring. And it really is. They can't actually experience it. So I'm telling my cannabis users, like, hey, I'm telling you, I like life better than you like life. I can feel things, right? I like a sunset better than you like a sunset. I had a young man a few years ago, I used that phrase, and he goes, hey, Dr. Boone, I bet you don't like a sunset better than me smoking marijuana watching a sunset. I'm like, I probably do, because you're trying to deal with a desensitized dopamine receptor population in your reward pathway that's been desensitized because of your cannabis use, right? And what I get is that I get that with every sunset. I get that with every sunrise, right? I get to feel and be a part of everything, right? So from a marijuana standpoint, is marijuana an addictive drug? Absolutely, yes. I mean, that data is absolutely clear. It works in the reward pathway. You build up desensitization. You get the same effect on the receptors in the reward pathway, and you get the same damage to that prefrontal cortex and that neurofeedback loop. Is it an addictive drug? Absolutely, yes. Is alcohol an addictive drug? Absolutely, yes. Is alcohol a legal drug? It is, right? The prohibition wasn't great, but alcohol kills more people. Alcohol kills more people than heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine combined, right? So I'm not talking legal versus illegal, right? I'm just talking kind of call a spade a spade. Is marijuana an addictive drug? Absolutely, yes. So honestly, what we really see is that there are a lot of young people who don't have addiction that might use a little marijuana in high school, might use a little marijuana in college, and not something that I think is a good idea at all. I'm not supporting that in any fashion. But what happens is when they don't have addiction issues, right? They're like, I got to study for a test. I'm going to get a job. They might do a drug screen or something, and they walk away, right? Because they don't care. They don't care. So when my patients are talking to me and they're like, hey, Dr. Boone, it's just not a big deal. Marijuana's just not a big deal. I'm like, oh, cool. Well, you recognize then if it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal to stop. Is it a big deal? Well, no, I don't want to. Why? Is it a big deal? Well, no, it's not a big deal. Okay, cool. So if it's not a big deal, stop. And then I'll have the conversation like, listen, do you recognize I did your admission story. When you got to La Hacienda, you had been charged, you had a possession charge. And the courts are doing drug testing on you. And the reason it finally got your attention to come here is because you can't pass a drug screen. You're risking your freedom. You're risking going to jail because you can't stop using cannabis. That sounds like a big deal to me. If I tell you don't eat carrots and you won't go to jail, would that be really hard? Right? I mean, if it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal to stop. So from a cannabis standpoint, potentially, and again, don't hear me, I'm not an advocate by any means. I think there's incredible, significant issues associated with marijuana, and it's a significant drug with these potencies that are just impressive. But if you look at that data, to some people will talk about cannabis is a little bit similar to alcohol. But what happens is that if you don't have addiction, then those people walk away. Risk benefit is not there. I'm not going to do that. I don't want that, right? And then the data and the usage and the IQ data and the memory retention. I mean, there's not a lot of us that go, gosh, I wish my memory was a little bit worse, right? I mean, that's not appealing for most of us. So cannabis, to argue so that it's not an addictive compound, simply an uneducated argument. So people who struggle with addiction, there's no such thing as, well, I think if I just smoke marijuana instead, I'll help get me away from heroin, get me away from my alcohol. Yeah, unfortunately, that data has been tried by hundreds of thousands or millions unsuccessfully. So cannabis. Now, I don't have specific slides about alcohol from the reward pathway, but alcohol works in the reward pathway via an effect on these neurotransmitters that are called GABA and glutamate. And so with alcohol, again, depending on the amount of alcohol consumed, the level of alcohol in your system has these recurrent surges of dopamine greater than that 150% threshold, which then damages those neurotransmitters, damages the neural feedback loop. I don't have impulse control. I don't have reasoning. Now, the other thing that I haven't talked about yet is that all of these substances also injure my prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex, where impulse control, judgment take place. So if you actually if we do volumetric MRI, and I look at the size of your prefrontal cortex, and I take somebody who's a regular drinker, drug user compared to the non-drinker, non-drug user, and I measure the size of that structure, like measuring the size of your bicep if you're working out, right? I can do a volumetric measure. And if I look at that, we see this atrophy, this atrophic, smaller prefrontal cortex. It actually has injury to the prefrontal cortex. So when people, for example, if we do blood flow studies, when we damage parts of our body, right, our body sends more blood to heal that. If your eyes are red, they're red because your body is sending more blood because you didn't get enough sleep. And so you're going to send more blood and more oxygen to your eyes. If you get smoke in your eyes, if you get an infection on your arm and it dilates, your arm is red and hot. It's red and hot because those blood vessels are dilated. When we do studies on the brain and we look at the frontal lobe, there's increased cerebral blood flow into that frontal lobe and prefrontal cortical region that goes out to the 4-year mark after people quit drinking, out to 4 years, which means that there is still abnormalities in that part of the brain, and our brain is still dilating blood vessels, trying to restore function, trying to restore. And the good news is you see improvement. And so if you actually look at function, whether that's on what we call functional MRI or SPECT scanning or even volumetric MRI studies, even with a month a month of sobriety, a month of time away from drug use, you start to see recovery of that prefrontal cortex. But that full recovery takes a long time. So again, just like physical rehabilitation, have a shoulder replacement, have a shoulder surgery, have a knee replacement, do something that you have to do some prolonged physical therapy to get recovery, to get things back. It takes a while. Now, here's some really fascinating data, and is that if you look at the part of the brain that becomes most activated with spiritual pursuits, it's the prefrontal cortex. So if you look at studies done, for example, even during they did a series with nuns, with some monks, with spiritual recitations, with prayer, and you see what part of the brain is actually being pulled in, what part of the brain is most stimulated and energized during meditation, during reflection on Christ, during reflection on God, during prayer, and this ability as we pursue spiritual pursuits, right? It's the prefrontal cortex. If I hurt my shoulder, I don't need to work out my knees, right? I need to strengthen my shoulder. How do I do that on my shoulder, right? I'm going to get with an OT person, a PT person, and I'm going to do work on my shoulder. The thing that's so fascinating, because we talk about, if I look via sort of the 12-step and what's called the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we talk about addiction, it's talked about as a spiritual malady. And if you actually look at the cure, quote unquote, the treatment, it's spiritual pursuits. And that now the fascinating thing is that these different reflections of God. And so when I say that, you can look at things that come with what's called mindfulness and meditation, that people talk about pursuing the spiritual dimensions of life. Now I'm talking here right to a group of believers. And so when we talk about spiritual principles, I'm thinking about God. I'm thinking about Jesus Christ, my Savior, right? There are other things in the spiritual dimension, right? There's a dark side in the spiritual dimension, but other religions, right? If you look at Buddhism, if you look at Hinduism, right? There is this acknowledgement of something bigger, right? Something bigger. We know what that is. But with this sort of God-designed planet, God-designed brain, even those other aspects, those other attributes from a spiritual standpoint, those things actually strengthen our prefrontal cortex. They help in the recovery process. And as we go into 12-step recovery and we look at that through a biblical lens, it's going to become even more clear about to me how critically important it is, and why those things help to speed up our brain healing and recovery, and ultimately to get us where we need to be. So I'm going to close with that. Next week we're going to talk about relapse and some of the neurobiology and brain issues around relapse. And then after that, we're going to move deeper into some of the 12-step recovery and some of those Christian principles and how we sort of incorporate all that together for wholeness. So let me close this in prayer. Father, I'm thankful for your presence with us today. Again, I just pray for each listener. I pray for each family member that might need this. I'm thankful for my church. I'm thankful for my pastor. I'm thankful for leadership. I'm thankful for friends. Father, be with us, and pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you.